Brad.
Hey, Bradley.
Hey, Brad.
Hey, hey.
How are you? Oh, we lost Brad.
He'll be back.
There he is. All right.
I join, I leave, I join, I leave.
Hey, that's all. Keep it exciting. That's right.
Good to see y'all.
Yeah, you too. You too. Well, I think we're good to go. We've got good amount of participants that are here, and I'm sure some that will continue to arrive with us. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. And first and foremost, special welcome to our local, regional, and national audience. We're really excited that you all could join us for this great discussion and a distinguished panel that we have. For those who don't know, my name is Tendai Charasika, and not only been a native of Louisville, Kentucky, but been contributing to the startup community and entrepreneurial ecosystem for the last decade. And most recently, over the last 7 years, been running a venture-backed company called Superfan. And so our discussion today is really centered around startup communities, entrepreneurial ecosystem development, and specifically for Louisville, how it's evolved over the last really 8 years or so. So we're excited about that. But first and foremost, the discussion couldn't happen without our event organizer, Amplify Louisville. So Amplify Louisville is a entrepreneurial support organization. Their mission is to be led by and to work for the benefit of entrepreneurs across the state, helping to gain access to programs, capital, talent, and other resources to help build scalable companies right here in our state and our region. So excited for that. Quick shout out to our sponsor today. So this also wouldn't be possible without our great entrepreneurial sponsor, PNC Bank. They do quite a bit in our community. And so we're excited to continue to have them support us and amplify Louisville and the great discussion here today. So once again, just want to welcome our distinguished panel, Wendy Lea, Ian Hathaway, and Brad Feld. And for lack of going into long biographies, et cetera, I've asked them each to just give quick 30-second intros, and we'll go from there. So Wendy, if you don't mind, just a quick 30-second intro on your background there.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Wendy Lea. I'm a girl from the Deep South. I've spent lots of time in Kentucky in the Midwest, which was an honor to be there. Two roles. Currently, I'm leading a nonprofit in the state of Colorado called Energize Colorado, helping small businesses navigate through this crazy set of crises we face and then begin to grow again. And I also had the good fortune to serve as a board member on Amplify, that public-private partnership there in Louisville. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you, Wendy. Ian, how about you, if you don't mind?
Yeah, Ian Hathaway. I work at, one of the co-authors of this book we're going to talk about, Startup Community Way. I work at Techstars. I also do some research and writing independently and through a couple of think tanks. Before that, have a background as a research economist, management consulting, and I also work with founders through a bunch of different channels. Although I live in California, I am a native of Dayton, Ohio. So I'm from the region and very familiar.
Yay, Dayton. Yay, Dayton. I even know where that is. Been there, done that.
And then rounding us around the corner, Mr. Feld there, if you don't mind.
Sure. Brad Feld, partner at Foundry Group, a venture fund that invests all across the U.S. In tech companies. We've got about $2.5 billion under management. We also invest in venture funds. About 25% of our capital is invested in over 30 venture funds, mostly seed and early stage. I'm also co-founder of Techstars, and I've been an entrepreneur, an angel investor, and now VC going back to 1987. So I mostly just feel old. I am solidly embracing my middle-agedness.
And you're a runner, aren't you? Aren't you a big runner?
I love to run. I've run 25 marathons. I'm now doing the thing on my shirt, I'm doing a race across the US or run across the United States called a marathon. It's a virtual run, so it syncs with your,
Cool.
I run with a Whoop and a Fitbit,
Okay.
syncs with the data and keeps track of mileage and sort of shows you how you're doing across the US. So
Yeah.
in the time of COVID, I figured I'd just run the US.
Wow, that sounds good to me. Well, excellent. Thank you each for the introduction. And we're just going to jump right in because there's so much to cover. And I know the audience, even though national, many are here and with a focus on Louisville in this region. And, you know, Brad, I'm sure you remember, but the last time you were here, at least the last time that you released Startup Communities in 2012, we actually had the pleasure of having you into the city and able to really digest that book with you during one of our annual celebrations of entrepreneurship. So, you know, in our mind, this conversation really helps to evolve and show where Louisville's come from since that time to where we are now. So I think it fits very well with the discussion of the Startup Community Way. And so the title of that book, Startup Community Way, Evolving the Entrepreneurial Ecosystem. So it's a perfect fit for where we are right now. And we'll get into some of the things that have occurred since that time in 2012 when you were last here. But most importantly, again, just jumping in, you know, why now? Why 8 years later, the sequel to Startup Communities? What are some of the key differences between startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems?
So why don't I answer why now, and let's give Ian what's the difference between a startup community and entrepreneurial ecosystem, because it's something that he and I worked hard on sort of defining and separating in this book. Ian and I have known each other for 5 or 6 years, and done a few things together. In 2017, he and I started talking about writing this book. We were both getting different versions of the question from people, sort of, I've been at this startup community thing for a while, what now? And now when I wrote Startup Communities, and I really wrote the book 2010, 2011, right? It came out in the beginning of 2012, which is when I visited, I guess in the fall of 2012, when I visited y'all. By 2012, startup communities were starting to be a thing. And of course, that language didn't exist. So the book gave that language to people to talk about this thing called a startup community. 2010, we were still at the tail end of the global financial crisis. And so I had this like couple of year period to think about why entrepreneurship and innovation was the path out of a global financial crisis, and more specifically, why cities needed startup communities. So 5 years later, 2012, 2017, people are like, hey, we've been at this for a while, now what? And, you know, one of the principles of Boulder thesis is you have to take a long-term view, you know, at least 20 years. And now I like to say it's at least 20 years in the future. Yeah. So I've been in Boulder for 25 years. So I'm not minus 5 years of my journey. I'm 25 into 45 years. And so in some ways, people saying sort of 5 years in, what now? You know, is a little bit like, hey, you got 15 more years before you should ask that question. But as Ian and I riffed on it, it's like, no, actually, it's a really helpful question because a lot has happened and we've learned a lot. And there's a lot of things that are different. And, oh, by the way, I made a few mistakes in the first book. So like sort of dealing with that and making sure that there was a way to sort of talk about this ongoing evolution along this long path rather than sort of beginning and end. Nice to see your Fitbit. Always makes me happy as an early investor in Fitbit whenever I see them in the road. So we started in 2017 working on this, and I would say we finished the book in 2018, or we'd finished the first draft of a book, which was 40, 50,000 words, and we were both very unhappy with it. We decided it sucked, and part of the struggle that we had was we were trying to answer the question, what should we do now? And we were definitely approaching it as sort of roadmap playbook, give people like very specific things to focus on. And it like whether it was good or not, it's irrelevant. Like it wasn't interesting to either one of us and it didn't feel right to either one of us. And in the midst of sort of struggling with what to do, including Ian having this is my first book, is this how it always goes? Maybe we shouldn't write a book. This sucks. I'm having a miserable time. Brad, what the fuck? You keep telling me you're going to work on it next weekend, and then 3 weeks go by and I don't hear from you. Sort of the struggles of that. Like our back and forth became crystallized when at one point Ian called me up and said, I've come up with the framing for this book. And I think we should just basically start over. And I said, okay, what's that? He said, I think we should use the idea of a complex adaptive system to describe what a startup community is. And fortunately, I knew some about complexity theory. So when he said that, it was definitely like a puzzle piece clicking into place. I'm like, yep, that's actually, let's talk about that more, but that's a really good framing. And I'm sure we'll go into complex systems sort of later in this conversation. But that was 2018. So we basically started with a blank sheet. We cut and pasted some of the old book into the new blank sheet, but we started over. And what crystallized for us in that moment, and sort of ongoing, start to overuse the word crystallize, is that one of the challenges I think so many people were having with startup communities in general was there were lots and lots and lots of frameworks being developed, whether it's by nonprofits or academics or consulting firms. And many of those frameworks were around, your entrepreneurial ecosystem. And those frameworks were generally, I would say, deterministic frameworks, of which we looked at all of them. And little bits and pieces from each of them was interesting, but none of them were actually particularly actionable. They just weren't that helpful to entrepreneurs and to people trying to build and develop startup communities. And that helped us think about this idea that as a complex system, the startup community doesn't have a roadmap. It doesn't have a playbook. It doesn't have a deterministic outcome. And so this idea of applying a framework, a roadmap, playbook, whatever you want to call it, to the startup community and frankly, to the entrepreneurial ecosystem, while kind of interesting in some places to try to size up what you've got, was actually not that helpful in terms of having people understand where they need to go and what they need to do. And so that then became the startup community way, where we really came up with, again, a set of principles, not a framework, not a recipe, not a roadmap. And we used language from complex adaptive systems and complexity theory to help give language to people to talk about what was going on in these kinds of systems or these startup communities. It's not lost on us. It was an accident, but it's not lost on us that we finished writing this book in roughly February, and it came out in July. And of course, what happened in March, we had a little bit of timing. There's a couple of references to COVID in the book. COVID is actually, the COVID crisis is a collision of multiple complex systems, right? And a simple way to think about the COVID crisis is it's a health crisis, the disease, that generated an economic crisis, which is, very, very complex in what it is. That is generating a mental health crisis. As humans, this is not the way we're used to being. It's also amplifying a racial equity crisis been going on in the US for over 400 years. And these four complex systems are overlapping with each other. And by the way, depending on what you think about what's going on, we have, whether you want to call it an environmental crisis or a climate crisis. If you think about, what we have been going through for the last 45 days in the West, in terms of the fires, it's another extraordinary crisis. And all of these things interact with each other. And the idea that there's a solution, and if you just do A, B, C, D, E, you will get to the answer, is complete nonsense.
Yeah.
And so it's powerful that in 2020, once again, we're in the midst of crises like we were in the global financial crisis. And Ian and I deeply, deeply, deeply believe that entrepreneurship and innovation is the path out of this one. And I have a belief that we've accelerated to 2025. There's a bunch of things that are lagging still, but we've essentially accelerated a path we were on as a country and maybe as a planet by 5 years. That's what COVID is effectively doing. And as a result, for entrepreneurs, the opportunities are so profound because of the number of things, incumbent systems that are either obsolete or collapsing, and the need for regeneration from that. So that's a sort of a good starting point to play with. Ian, like, we have a chapter that talks about the difference between startup community, entrepreneurial ecosystem. All yours to build off of me.
Yeah. So I would describe, so this chapter is something that I think about, Brad gave a nice overview of what this book is about, the evolution of his thinking, and a little bit about our process. I view the creation of this book, we've been talking more about our journey, which is actually really important because it's reflective of building a startup community. This is one of the pieces, this distinction between the community and ecosystem, which there are two implications to this chapter, which the first was that, we didn't set out to write this chapter. It was just, it emerged along the way as something that needed to be written, much like Brad was talking about taking this systems view and framing it around complex adaptive systems specifically, but this was also a clear response of what we viewed as some fundamental misalignment within the broader entrepreneurial ecosystems. So I'll just we could go deep on this for a while. I know we are constrained on time, so I'll try to be brief, but slight overgeneralization, but if you think of it as sort of the people, the entrepreneurs and people who are working with entrepreneurs on a daily basis, sometimes they are representing organizations. Maybe they are, working for an accelerator, innovation center, something along those lines. But the function of that organization is to work with entrepreneurs. And then a bunch of people who work with entrepreneurs in an individual capacity, who sort of understand these as taking an entrepreneur-centric approach, being bottom-up, experimental, understanding the inherent uncertainty of this all. And then kind of this much broader group of actors, which are typically organizations, who want to engage with the entrepreneurs in some capacity. More likely, they want an economic benefit, a relationship with entrepreneurship in a community, whether you're a government official who wants economic growth and job creation, whether you're, a corporate executive who wants sponsorship opportunities, or, possibly some innovation opportunities. So, but what we found was happening is there was antagonism between these two groups often. And rather than framing it as, well, one group gets it, this bottom-up phenomenon, the other doesn't, it was just a recognition that they're different things, that they approach this relationship through not just different organizational structures, right? We talked about, Brad talked about networks versus hierarchies in startup communities. We reiterate that in this book. We talk about it in new ways, but it's also different incentive structures, right? And so we talk about systems being the parts, the interactions, and the purpose. A startup community has one purpose. It's to help entrepreneurs succeed. It's okay that governments who want to engage with entrepreneurs and corporates and universities and all these other actors, investors and so on, it's okay that that's not perhaps their top priority. It's okay that they want to benefit from this and be a part of it as an organization. But as individuals, we must approach this as working with entrepreneurs for the sole purpose so that they will succeed. And so we think of it as, a system within a system. Mm-hmm. I heard Brad was involved with a discussion at MIT a few weeks ago. I love this description of an ecosystem as collections of communities that are linking up. You've got the university community, the entrepreneurial community, and so on. And these are all linking up for a variety of purposes, an innovation ecosystem, an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so it's just recognizing these differences and being okay with that, but calling that out as fundamentally distinct concepts and understanding why there might be inherent frictions in the way that we engage.
So, that's a great segue to the next question. And so let's dig in a little bit deeper around the ecosystem. So Wendy, question for you, and some of the things that you have seen around the country and working with some of these actors, governments, universities, corporations, a lingering question or initiative for Louisville's entrepreneurial community has been, how do we get large corporates to be engaged?
I knew you were going to ask me that question.
You knew I was coming for it. It's a question that's on the mind, I think, of probably everyone on this call, and it's been something we've been focused on for years, trying to get the Humanas and Norton Healthcares and GEs. But in your perspective, what is maybe the disconnect from getting large corporates really involved and engaged in that 20-year journey?
Well, I don't know if it's a disconnect. I'll just share the experience I had and how I iterated it and figured it out, right? And created a pattern that led to value that could be exchanged through lots of entities inside an ecosystem. And that was, it struck me in one of my most recent experiences in the Midwest that very large corporates, first of all, needed digital technologies. I'm just going to use that as jargon, digital technologies, to drive organic growth and internal efficiency. And I know that sounds like, high level whatever, but I experienced that to be true. And what these large companies would often do, not always, but often, is that they would, go to either coast, because mainly I'm talking Midwest, to talk to VCs or others that could help them meet and be exposed to these startups that were producing this innovation. And so I thought, wow, these large companies are going all over sourcing, vetting, evaluating new ways to do the same thing they've always been doing, instead of just buying from traditional vendors that they probably pay too much money to, I'm just saying, and not very good stuff on top of that. And I'm not talking just software, I'm talking all kinds of capability, not just software. But I thought, well, why wouldn't they just get to know the folks, the entrepreneurs, the founders, the startups in their own city? It seems very smart to me. Efficient, right? Effective, and a way not just to, give first, but to get some economic value moving in their region, in their city, in their state. So to me, it was just so pragmatic. I was naive about a lot of things, but the pragmatism that I held there relative to what these large companies might need really made sense to me. Now then, as Larry knows, and you know because you know me, just saying it does not make it so, right? Because you have to really understand the dynamics inside these large companies and their ability to take risk with early stage founders, et cetera. But I'm grateful in several experiences, not just one, but in several, including in Louisville, that once you kind of get that and you can orient the positioning of a startup community, the talent and the innovation, the products and services they're building in the right way to these large corporations. It doesn't happen overnight, because what in life does? Right. But if you consistent with that story and that exchange of value, and these large companies are desperate for growth, maybe that's too strong. They're eager for organic growth. They know how to do inorganic growth, and they love their region, and they want their region to prosper. Yes, they want resilience. They want vibrancy. And so they know that comes from bright minds like yours and Larry's, right? And people that are building and thinking differently. So that's, to me, I would prefer, and I've said this to Larry, so this is a broken record to both of you in Louisville, I would prefer to engage a large corporation by exchanging value, business value with them, rather than engaging them to sponsor an event.
Mhm.
It's harder, and there are two places to get money, a place to sponsor an event and a place to deliver value, to exchange value. And it's harder sometimes to get to the buyers, the syndicates that you can exchange value with through a pilot. But I'd rather do that because I think the ultimate benefit, the long tail of that benefit, is more significant, even on the economic vibrancy side. Then Humana, love them, love Bruce, love his team, but him just sponsoring something, that's not exactly the exchange of value that ultimately will spread through his organization if we source and vet and make the connection properly. So anyway, I fell into it. It's not like I had a playbook. I didn't get taught by Brad or Ian at the time. It just seemed sensible to me that if I could find enough really smart entrepreneurs, and if I had enough connections in some of the companies, that stream of value would help us lift up the whole startup community and ultimately the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And so you have reiterated this notion of talented people, creatives to really help drive and build startup communities, companies, the next ideas, the connection into these corporations. So my next question is really centered around really economic development. And a question to maybe Brad and or Ian would be, does traditional economic development models, and we have some on the call now today, I used to be one, is traditional economic development models, do they have it wrong? Should they be focused on touting their culture, their talent, trying to recruit the best and brightest creatives to town versus headquarter attraction?
I'll go. So is the choice between growing locally, because I'm not, so the distinction between using incentives, financial incentives to bring companies to town versus creating the type of environment where, creative, knowledge workers would want to live. Are these both, is this a choice between locally grown, or are we attracting different types of people to the region, or is it a little bit of both?
A little bit of both, but also, particularly for, a city like Louisville, I won't call it exact stagnant population growth, but, over the last really decade, Louisville's grown by less than 5%, probably even less than that, frankly. And so our efforts, to be able to attract headquarters has not been overly successful, if we're honest about it. But the key aspect that we've talked about is just having great talent. So how do we bring that talent in, right, that maybe hasn't already been exposed to Louisville before? They weren't born here, they weren't raised here, but we want to bring them here because we need that talent, whether we're going to feed existing companies or have companies that are created here.
Well, I guess maybe I would challenge the notion that talent needs to be brought to town, that there isn't already talent existing in the region. And also, look, having been, having grown up in a city that's not the same as Louisville, but, similar, some similar economic outcomes, the biggest problem is people not staying, right? It's not really for me about attracting new folks. I mean, that's helpful, but I really do buy the first vibe, which is, I'll use kind of a straw man, a generic example. How do you get the native daughters and sons of Louisville who have gone off to New York or San Francisco or other places, worked for Google or, big media companies, things like that. How do you get them to come back home? I think seeing success happen, an attitude that's driving towards success. I think, creating an environment that feels appealing to them. I'll use a great example. Last year, Brad and I had the chance to visit Knoxville, Tennessee. Neither of us had been there before. And we were both walking around. Brad's wife was with us, Amy, and we loved the vibe, and we thought, this looks like the type of place we could live. And I can't really fully articulate the list of things that made it so, but that vibe is really important, right? We're big subscribers to the Richard Florida creative class theory about making it an interesting place. And we can't guarantee those types of people are going to come, and we can't guarantee that they're going to have the entrepreneurial successes, but it's helpful to steer it in that direction. There's also an interesting case. I know I keep promoting the book here, but there's an example from Jerusalem where the mayor of Jerusalem is quoted as saying, I think it would have been more beneficial to have a rock band competition than a startup competition here, because it made Jerusalem cool. And there definitely is that vibe. I'll just say generally as a final note, I think that incentives, I think this has been very well documented by economists, that race to the bottom, zero sum, economic development strategies around lauding major corporations to move headquarters to a city are just not very efficient. I think they're very expensive, and money could be put into other resources, such as, seeding a more vibrant, locally grown entrepreneurial community.
Yeah, that's great. Wendy, I think you said you wanted to.
Oh, just a follow-up. I mean, Ian is the economist of the family here, so I'm going to lean on his expertise there. But in my experience, first of all, I never even knew really what economic development was before I took the role I had in Cincinnati. I mean, I had no clue, because you don't really talk about economic development in San Francisco, right, which is where I had been prior for a decade. So I'm like, what? Economic development? What is that? But the point is, I learned a lot about it there in Ohio, and again, and through the CED in Kentucky. Here's how I see traditional economic development. I see it as like direct selling. It's one channel. You get some prospects, you get some propositions, some tax incentives and some sites, and you get a whole posse of people, and you make a proposal and you try to go close, like cities all over the US did when Amazon was looking for a second headquarters. Well, I think that's fine. I mean, Ian would know, how the real effectiveness of that has been over the years, over the decades. But I think, okay, fine. You get a bunch of people, smart people, they do their research, they bid, they have incentives. Okay, good. I see startup communities and ecosystem development as a much longer term strategy that does support economic development, because we all know where the real jobs come from, and they come from young businesses that get supported and get a chance to grow over time. So if I'm going to be the governor, I'm too old to do that, but maybe in another lifetime I'll come back and be a governor. I do think about it, trust me. But in my next life, when I'm a governor, I'm going to have both strategies, and they're going to be very well integrated, right? So we're going to have that direct selling team that really knows how to, share the story, pull together the right package, and show up in that list. And then all around those folks, we're going to have a stream of activities that we're constantly iterating that help with business growth from the ground up all the time. And that will attract plenty of people, and it will retain those. Remember, these large companies, what they need is talent too. What they need is their cities to be, absolutely filled with people buying $5 coffees and attracting others to come around. So then we get to pay taxes, we get some coffees, and we get to hang out and see each other. That's the vibe that I've been to Knoxville many times, and I know it exists there. And my guess is that's what Ian and Brad experienced too, not just downtown, but in other places. So that's what I would say. Both are important, right? We want both strategies because some large companies have to be courted.
That's right.
If they're going to move from Berlin or they're going to move from Taiwan, they need that traditional courting process of direct selling. Otherwise, I want a ground game moving where we can build an ecosystem. How's that sound?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So taking that and, flipping this question over to Brad and going back to 2012 and what came out of the discussions with startup communities were a number of just programming events, celebration of entrepreneurs, accelerator programs like Accelerate Health. We had traditional entrepreneurship programs turn into accelerators like the Vote Invention and Innovation Awards, co-working spaces. I mean, today we have several, one of which, Story Louisville, to name a few. I mean, it's just been remarkable. The access to capital. Okay, Brad, what's the grade? What's the score? What's the data? Are we winning? Are we losing? I know you cover this in the book, and I think everybody on this call wants to know, how's Louisville doing? How do we stack up? How do we measure success?
Well, that's probably a setup for a conversation about chapter 11 in the book, which is a chapter we call the measurement trap. And I think it's a chapter that's a really fun chapter, so I encourage people to sort of dig into it. But Ian and I tried to articulate in the book a couple of different times, a couple of different ways, is that the answer to the question that you just asked is it doesn't matter. And part of the nature of most of us is that we want to measure things and we want to compare ourselves to other things. But here we're not playing a zero-sum game, right? We're playing a positive-sum game. So it's not a I win, you lose. It's we can all benefit and have a positive feedback loop that causes things to continue to grow. The cliche would be, rising tide lifts all boats or something like that. But it's really something different than even that. It's this positive feedback loop that has a lot of unpredictable impacts on things. And as long as you're approaching things in a collaborative, positive way, you can get really significant positive increases. Second, there's this construct that we talk about in complexity theory called a phase transformation or a phase shift, where things look a certain way until suddenly they're not. And they're just totally different. So this phase shift where, if you extrapolate it out, it would be like this line, but the phase shift causes this dislocation in a meaningful way. And then the third construct is that these aren't linear phenomena. They tend to be nonlinear in complex systems. So in a nonlinear phenomena or a curve that looks like this, if you make your time horizon small enough, what you're looking at as a small segment looks like a line. But if you come back out and look with a long enough time horizon, you actually can start to see this geometric curve. So it's very, very hard to compare that stuff just a priori. Second, a point that we make is that the cliche that we're all used to, which is the cliche, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And it's often attributed to Peter Drucker. It's actually not the right interpretation of what he was saying. And as a result, the cliche, like so many cliches, while it has an element of truth to it, it can be very harmful if applied. The real message is if you don't measure the right things, you can't manage them. And the challenge in much measurement around startup communities, entrepreneurial ecosystems, economic development, health of cities, measure the parts. They measure how many of this. They measure the number of startups, the number of jobs, the number of exits, the amount of capital raised, things like that. those are the easy things to measure. They're not the important things to measure. The important things are the interaction between the parts. And those are incredibly hard to measure. And it's not just the number of interactions, but the value of the information that's exchanged in those interactions. Super hard to measure. And so the measurement trap chapter goes through a lot of classical measurement models and talks about what's useful and what's not useful from each of them. This is, by the way, another challenge with, I think, a lot of the ecosystem models and frameworks, is that they tend to be very parts centric, and their measurements tend to be very linked to the measurement of those parts. So you need more of this, more of that. We have another section that talks about both, basically the myth, the more of everything problem, or the myth of more of everything. Like, you actually don't want necessarily more of some things at moments in time. It's not that more is necessarily better. Could be, but not necessarily. So, the question that you ask is, how does Louisville compare? My reaction kind of is, I don't know and I don't care. And you shouldn't care either. What you should care about instead is to start to focus on where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are, and apply energy to your strengths to generate attraction of things that support your weaknesses. Last comment on this, and we have a section called the 7 capitals. And so that you don't have to listen to me the whole time, I'll bounce it back to Ian to talk about the 7 capitals, which came out of some of this thinking too, which is one of the things you hear from places over and over again is, we don't have enough capital here. And what they're really saying is, we don't have enough money here. And whether that's true or not, a lot of cases it's not true either. It might be true that you don't have enough capital, you don't have enough money that's investing in tech companies or investing in startups. All of our wealth is investing in real estate or investing philanthropically. Different issue than we don't have any of it. But we focused on the idea that what people were talking about was financial capital, which is one of the 7 capitals. And I'll volley it back to Ian to talk about that.
Yeah, so I want to make one comment on the measurement issue and we can circle back to this capitals thing, which is, just be really clear on what it is that you want to know. I mean, I know everyone loves these data dashboards. You can compare your city to the other along these dimensions, these various capitals. But what is it that you actually care about? Like, for me, Brad hinted at this, which is, it doesn't really matter where Louisville ranks on metric X compared to Toledo, Ohio, or Omaha, Nebraska, or whatever. There are so many inputs and processes going on that, like, even if you push that lever, do you even really know what the outcome of that would be? For me, it's very simple. Like, there's the startups and then the community. Why are we even talking about this, right? It's the community as a word we've chosen to, describe this phenomena of collaboration, right? We're conceptualizing it through that word. We use the word community because, we talk about this a little bit in the book, that it's not just interactions, it's like a sense of identity. I don't want to use the word family, but just more like, we're coming around a common purpose. We have a shared identity. It's not just an economic relationship. So the things I want to measure, is this coming together, making it easier for entrepreneurs to succeed or not, right? And maybe we could structure those questions around a particular intervention, this type of program, this networking event, whatever the hell it is this thing making it easier for the participants to succeed? Whether that's getting a key relationship, meeting a co-founder, customer, whatever it is. Think about it in those terms and resist the temptation to fall in love with these macro level kind of comparative metrics. Those are temporal outcomes from everything that came before it anyway. Yeah. Having said that, rant over. The 7 capitals is just a way of conceptualizing the resources. So there are a bunch of different ecosystem models out there. One of the things that I thought was confusing about so many of them was the mixing of the people in the organizations with the thing that they do. What is the thing they're bringing to the table? And so we separate actors and factors, right? The people in organizations, the resources and conditions that come together to help produce entrepreneurship. We call it the 7 capitals for the reasons Brad stated. You know, they're assets, they produce value, they're degradable, they're forward-looking, right? Sounds like capital. And by the way, it's a play on words to say, don't obsess over this one type of capital, right? Realizing that the formation of financial capital in the sense of venture capital, right? Angel capital, that's how it's often equated. That will follow entrepreneurial successes. There's a whole chapter on sequencing that follows this. And that's why we stress that, but focus on the other things that you can control, right? We talk about intellectual capital, human capital, network capital, did I say intellectual, institutional, physical capital, right? Like that's, we talk about as quality of place. We've just had this discussion. Network capital and cultural capital. So many of these things are within the domain of individuals to take action, right? And so we can improve these capitals today. We don't have to wait, right? We don't have to, get a government fund of funds going to stimulate venture capital activity. We can do that. Maybe we should, right? I'm okay with that. But that's not the only thing. There are so many other things, and they're much more actionable than these other resources that are, these external things that take time to develop anyway.
That's great. So sticking along kind of human capital, it particularly really all over this country, but in Louisville, we don't have to look far outside our windows to see social injustices occurring and really pushing some hard conversations that, I know Brad has spoken for years, as long as I've known him, around diversity and inclusion. And so this question is really for Wendy and some of the communities that you've seen in your experiences. But, why does it matter? Why does diversity and inclusion particularly matter today, and how does that conversation evolve from where it was just even 5 years ago or even 10 years ago?
Well, diversity fuels creativity and innovation, right? I mean, diverse thinking, just at its simplest form, will usually, not always, but will usually create a stronger, more interesting, more compelling set of outputs. So if we just apply that to people, not just the thoughts in our heads, but a range of people, it would make sense that the more diverse our entrepreneurs are and our community is, the higher probability that we will be more creative, more innovative, find new solutions to old problems and to those that haven't even occurred yet. So that's kind of a baseline thought for me. For whatever reason, we can't seem to stay on that baseline thought, right? We skew off of that. But whenever I see this injustice occurring again, it makes me wonder, like, we've missed the baseline again. If we're all the same, we look the same, we act the same, we go to the same schools, then likely the level of creativity and innovation is going to be the same. And with the world spinning as fast as it is, that's not going to be helpful, right? So that would be a simple answer. I know that here in our state, Brad in particular has really encouraged his community, I'm part of his community, to not just think in a baseline way, but to be intentional about how we might shift the pattern relative to entrepreneurship and all kinds of business segments. So I think that takes courage and lots of hard conversations, lots of intentionality, and just learning all the time, listening and learning all the time. But he's my mentor when it comes to helping me lead others because of how I see his behavior and how eager he leans in and learns and then helps us all do the same. It takes a lot of work because I don't know, we're lazy as humans. I don't know why we're lazy. We just don't like to get out of our own little potholes or whatever they are. That's all I can say. But over to you, Brad. What would you comment? Because you've been a great teacher for me in this way, especially this year when it's been so difficult.
And Brad, maybe take that segue as well. And as we start to land the plane here, I've got one more question for all the panelists, but take that question and just talk about that 20-year commitment. Give us a view, how do you see startup communities evolving over the next 20 years, the best that you can kind of digest?
If I link what Wendy just said in that question, it makes me immediately think of one of the biggest challenges that we have as humans, and that's short attention spans. And, if you look at, especially if you look at our existence today in today's society, the amount of things that happen and that distract us. I love dogs. We have a giant golden retriever, and I like to describe most human beings as being very similar to the dog, where the dog will be paying attention to you, and then you'll say squirrel, and the dog will go like this. And we have not just social structures that say squirrel all the time. We've allowed ourselves to engage with devices and software, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. And we've subjected ourselves to media, whether it's CNN, Fox, whatever, that have all created this, and I think it's a negative feedback loop, not a positive feedback loop, but this feedback loop that creates even shorter attention spans. And one of the big challenges in anything against the backdrop of short attention spans is doing things that take a long time. And a lot of things take a long time. And anybody out there who's ever started a company and been an entrepreneur, every now and then there's an overnight success, but most of the time it takes a long time to build a successful company. And, even overnight successes might be 10, 15, 20 years in the making. And I think this is the same phenomena as it applies to any category of activity around any of these issues we're talking about, whether it's diversity and inclusion, whether it's growth, development, and startup community, whether it's a sort of broad economic shift in a geography, whether it's a fundamental change in cultural norms between people who are interacting with each other. These things just take a long time. And so you have to then just decide to stay on them for a long time. And your commitment level to them in terms of it being front of mind can vary, right? One of the things we see with startup communities all the time is entrepreneurs will go through periods where they've got plenty of time for the startup community. And then they'll go through periods of time where they don't. And they don't because they're doing a financing, or they're selling their company, or they're going public, or they have a lot of stress in their business and they can't engage the same way. And that's okay. You have to create cultural norms that allow people to engage deeply and to sort of ebb and flow versus this phenomena that's unrelenting. Another way to think about the next 20 years, let's be clear, 20 years from now it'll be 2040. So everybody think about how old they are in 2040. Try to, whether your parents are alive or not, try to think about where your parents were at that age relative to 20 years earlier. Go back to 2000 and think about where you were at 2000 and the things that you could have predicted about where you'd be at 2020 or not. My wife, Amy, loves to say that pretty much anything anyone predicted about 2020 wasn't going to be right. Right? No, this was not the year that anybody predicted, and certainly going back 20 years ago. So I think that same phenomena is at play here, which is it's extremely difficult to envision 20 years in the future. I think if you link it though to startup communities, 10 years ago, the construct didn't exist. And 10 years ago, the idea that if you were serious about starting an entrepreneurial company, and specifically a tech company, but really broadly an entrepreneurial company, if you weren't in the Bay Area, you weren't serious, or you couldn't really build something in the US unless you're in the Bay Area. Even 10 years ago, the amount of a perception globally that if you're serious about creating an entrepreneurial company, you needed to be in the US was very significant. I don't remember the exact percentage in 2010, but let's say 80% of venture capital dollars were US based and 20% were rest of the world. Today, 80% of venture capital dollars are US and China, and 20% is rest of the world. And so, I mean, US lost half of its market share to one country in a decade of venture capital dollars. Now, the total absolute number of venture capital dollars between 2010 and now, a huge increase in global venture capital dollars. So this notion of where innovation is going and the democratization of entrepreneurship globally is accelerating. I think in the same way that in 2010, the idea of a startup community didn't exist. In 2020, people understand what startup communities are. And they're at all different stages of development and health, but there's an understanding of what it is and the importance to every city. I'm hopeful that in 2040, it's actually not that important of a separable construct anymore, right? It is just woven into the fabric of what happens around the characteristics of the city. In the same way, for example, that if you think about other categories, you think about the arts, you think about education, you think about the environment, most cities, those are important things to the city. If the city has a university, the university is an academic or intellectual center, but also an attractor of young people, important part of the city. My hope is the startup community is a similar thing in importance 20 years from now.
That's beautiful. That's great, Brad. Thank you so much. And just a couple of closing comments from Wendy and Ian. 20 seconds or less. What's one or two things you want the audience to take away with them, whether it be from the book or just from the conversation or in general?
Can I go first? Can I go first, Wendy? I have another speaking engagement in 30 seconds.
Oh, of course.
I just want to, let me see if I can get this out right. In this context of inclusion, I think we have to go a step further than being inclusive, right? I think we have to be active. Humans, for a variety of reasons we've just talked about, tend to sort into homogenous groups, whether that's by race, gender, sexual orientation, university, all of these sorts of things. If you're particularly in the dominant group within you're in a clique in a company, you're from a socioeconomic background in a city that's the dominant group, the one with more access and opportunity, it's more than making people feel included. It's actively seeking out those disparate nodes, those communities that are self-organizing and bringing them into the fold. So I don't know if the word is inclusivity or integration, whatever it is, we need to go a step further. So for people in those communities, be a leader and integrate these things better. That's it. Thank you for having me.
See you later. I would say in closing for me is be a patient activator, right? So I pride myself in being an activator, and I attempt to be as strategic as I can be with my activation. I've also learned as I get more mature and hopefully wiser that patience is required when change is demanded, right? And so we jump to conclusions and then we judge and then we get sad. There's all this emotionality and reaction when really we know we have a vision for the future, for ourselves, our businesses, and our communities. We know that. We need to be more explicit with that vision to make it come true. Then we need to walk backwards and say, okay, this is not going to happen overnight, but every hour and every day, I need to be active in manifesting that future. Mm-hmm. But I can't manifest something that I can't draw and see. So being an active innovator is what good, I think, ecosystem builders are about, right? You just can't be jerked back and forth. So that would be how I would like to wrap up my portion of this esteemed session.
Well, this has been extremely valuable, insightful, not just in the sequel of the book, but also just in understanding our community just a little bit more, where we are and where we want to go. And I know that there's a number of great entrepreneurs and leaders
Sure.
on this call today, and we're also impacted, but at the same time, our entrepreneur community all across this country, but particularly here in Louisville, so drawn together and so tight. And so it's we really appreciate you all finding some time here to kind of digest our questions and just giving your input as well.
And I want to give Larry a shout out. Larry, for your leadership in Louisville, we're very grateful for what you're doing for the startup community and for founders there. So thank you for that. I know it's hard work, but it'll be rewarding work. And with that, thank you, Brad. Thank you for letting me listen and learn from you over and over. I love that part of my life. And I miss Louisville very much. And I hope one day soon I'll get on a big bird and come visit. Who knows?
Absolutely. Brad, any final word from you? You good?
Just thanks for having me. And I remember my day in Louisville well, and I was in Lexington, I think, for 3 or 4 days because I had come. I'm trying to remember if it was not around the Cincinnati Marathon. I had a good friend that was in Lexington, and that ended up being the draw. And I planted for a couple of days. Had a great time in 2012. Yep. And I look forward at some point in the future being there again. But it's just a joy to be part of this. And thanks for spending the hour with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, audience. Thank you all for those
thank you all for hanging with us.
Larry, you'll receive a copy of the book, and want to say once again thank you to our sponsor PNC Bank as well. So
thank you, Chuck at PNC.
That's right. Great people.
See you later.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care.